If a player cleans his ball during play of a hole, except on the putting green, he shall incur a penalty of 1 stroke. That's the rule, Jerry.
But it's just a friendly game. Why do you always have to be such a stickler?
Because that's the way I was raised.
Welcome to Spirit of the Game, brought to you by the Colorado Golf Association. Here are your hosts, Ed Mate and Lewis Harry.
All right, welcome back. It's a new year is here. It's 2025. Hard to believe. Actually, full disclosure, Lewis Harry is missing in action over the holiday break. He's ignoring me, but that's okay. It's glad he needs some rest. Greg With is joining me. This is Ed Mate. All right, so we're going to have some fun today. It's January, and we're going to do a little mailbag. We've received a number of emails. We thought it'd be fun to get some listeners' feedback and ask some questions and just see what's on the minds of our listeners. So the first question out of the gate kind of comes on the heels after the PNC championship won by Bernhard Langer and his son, beating none other than Tiger and Charlie Woods. And this writer, who will remain nameless, says, I was once again disgusted to see the cheater Bernhard Langer win a tournament at the PNC. Everyone knows he's anchoring that putter. How can he get away with this? So, Greg, let's talk about this. It doesn't seem to want to go away. I know a lot of people just won't let go of this. But from a pure rules perspective, how do you respond to this frustrated listener?
Well, I agree with you. I don't think it's ever going to go away because it looks like he's anchoring or it's very close to anchoring. I guess my position is that I attend a number of USGA workshops, and the instructors for this are the USGA officials for the US Open and other USGA championship, as well as the PGA officials who are monitoring the types of tournaments that Bernhard plays in. So they get this all the time. And they get it from rules officials who are in these classes saying, it looks to me like he's anchoring. Show me how he's not anchoring. So they've examined tons of video evidence on this, looking to see if there was or is a breach of the rules in the technique that he employs. They've also asked him about it, and Bernhard is very open. He'll take him out on a putting green and show them exactly how it putts or how he putts. And, they look very closely, and it's their opinion after looking at the video from past tournaments, as well as Bernhard taking the time to show him exactly how he putts, that he is not anchoring. So they think he's in compliance. Bernhard is also known for his integrity in the game of golf. And I think he is the last person who would ever want to be known as someone who is manipulating the rules to his advantage. And I think that's demonstrated by him taking the time to show the people who make these decisions and wrote the rules to begin with exactly how he putts. And if indeed he were anchoring, I think he'd be the first one to change his technique.
So just staying with this for a minute longer on the principle or the purpose behind this rule. Clearly, what year was this changed, Greg? Was this 2019? No, this was before 2019. Do you remember the year?
I'd have to look it up, but it was before 2019.
Yeah, and the whole idea is that that the game of golf is not a tripod approach. You should have. You shouldn't have the stability and the anchor to provide that to take the nerves out of the putting stroke. It's just one of those. I think we've got it right. If he's lightly touching his shirt, he's not anchoring. It kind of reminds me of the line Woody Allen said he got kicked out of school for cheating on his metaphysics final by staring into the soul of the boy sitting next to him. Only one person knows whether he's gaining an advantage here, and that's Bernhard Langer. So again, I think we understand the principle, and I think for the most part, we've got it right. You see a lot of other things around putting where players will tuck a shirt in to kind of create a feeling that almost serves as you have others using the arm lock. So again, I think ultimately, as long as the brain's involved, it's going to the nerves are going to enter the equation.
Next question.
Okay, next question. Well, actually, let's stay with this just for a minute. When it comes to these minuscule distances, in this case, literally maybe a millimeter, what do you do in the rules when the question is going to be resolved in a matter of very small distance? So, for example, this is related in that respect, not related from the totally different rule. But if I'm dropping at knee height, or I'm watching my opponent, somebody I'm playing with drop it at knee height, and they fail to get it, it appears to me it's an inch too high or an inch too low. When do you intervene? When do you say something, and when is it close enough for government work, so to speak? How do you approach that?
Well, there's always going to be discrepancies on the height that a person drops from. They could be standing on the incline of a hill, and whether they're dropping to the low side or the high side would make a difference. Your knee is not an exact point. There's, the bottom of your knee, bottom of the kneecap, and the top of the kneecap. So that's about 3 inches there. I think most people, when they drop from knee height. And if it looks like it's an inch or two low or an inch or two high, those elements that I just talked about might be the reason that it looks that way. If someone takes a drop from their waist, and I'm working as a rules official, I'm just going to inject myself into the procedure, and I'm just going to ask him to redrop, and I'll say something as simple as, it looks like you dropped from your waist. Let's get it right. There's no penalty here. We just need to procedurally drop from knee height, and that takes care of it.
So if the player does not correct that, in my head, I used to think that was a 2-stroke penalty, but now it's only 1. Is that right?
Yeah, if they drop in the relief area and they play it from there, it's only 1.
And that was was that a 2019 change? I know I'm quizzing you here, like you're ready for the rules exam. I know that doesn't really, because again, we got rid of so many of the salt in the wound penalties, but it felt to me like in the old days, if you dropped improperly and played it, that was a 2-stroke penalty. Was that correct?
Yes, it's a kinder, gentler USGA. And, many of the things that used to be 2-stroke penalties are now just procedural errors, and they're 1-stroke penalties.
Very good. So I guess the bottom line is, if you see somebody dropping within the vicinity of their kneecap, probably not worth splitting hairs over. But if they're way off, they're at their ankle, they're at their waist, maybe it's time to say something. All right, let's move on to the next question. Pleased to see somebody listen to our pace of play segment. They said, I listened to your segment on pace of play, and I share your frustration. I'm in a men's club, and I'm thinking about quitting because it just takes too long. What do you think about using the model local rule that eliminates stroke and distance, or the alternative? There's a second part to the question, but let's pause on that. What do you think, Greg, about in a men's club competition using the model local rule? When this rule was introduced, I thought it was a great additional opportunity to improve pace of play. And it was one of the last things in 2019 to get resolved. And I'm a bit surprised that it doesn't get more widely used. What are your thoughts?
I think for casual club play, it makes a lot of sense to use the local rule that allows you to, when you hit a ball out of bounds or it's lost, you establish a reference point, and the rule is pretty clear on how to do that. And then you bring the ball 2 club lengths out into the fairway, and then behind that is your relief area. And you almost have to see the diagram to see how that works. The relief area is huge. Um, but it gets someone back into play immediately, and it costs them 2 penalty strokes instead of stroke and distance. Um, the score that the player posts is probably going to be the same because, we adjust that for, double net par and, excuse me, double bogey, uh, double
Yeah,
net bogey. Yeah,
net double
I
bogey,
know.
right?
And so there's a limit to how high a score that you can post. So it's probably going to be the same score. So for handicapping purposes, um, you know, it's not going to be any different. Keeps people moving, um, and they're going to end up with a high score on the whole, whether they had to go back to the T pad or whether they use the new local rule. So I'm in favor of it. It takes a little education on the part of the head pro to explain people how to use it and how to take relief. I think competitions at the highest levels, like the club championships and certainly USGA and PGA championships, you can't use it. But, for casual play, it's great.
So, if we started kind of going through the continuums of competitive golf, starting, as you said, at casual golf, moving up to, let's say, a fourth flight in a given Saturday men's or women's event, all the way up to the club championship, up to the, state championships, and on and on and on. We spoke prior to coming on the air here that I actually would posit that why not use it higher up the continuum, so to speak, because the benefits of the time saved, particularly in the amateur game, when you don't have galleries and extra eyes out there to prevent balls from being lost, it just would, in my opinion, really help us in pace of play, even in the state championships, if we use this more generously. Um, so I personally would, if the Common Ground Men's Club said we'd like to use the model local rule, I'd say absolutely use it every single event and use it even in the club championship, and I wouldn't hesitate. Um, Again, how if you were on that rules committee at your club and it was proposed, let's use the model local rule in the club championship, how would you vote?
Well, I don't think that I get to make a decision in a vacuum. I think you have to involve that men's or women's association and say, what do you guys want to do? The risk in doing that is, particularly, the further up you get is if there's not acceptance to using the model local rule, um, it's just not going to work. People are going to be dissatisfied. Because essentially what happens is when you use this model local rule, you're getting a ball into play um, based on where your ball went out of bounds or where it's thought to be lost. Um, if that player were to go back to the tee pad, there's no guarantee that he's going to hit his next ball or his next 3 balls onto the golf course. And so he's potentially could get a much lower score because we're going to let him get back in play near where his ball went out of bounds. Whereas if he goes back to the tee pad and hits 2 more out of bounds, that's, potentially 4 extra strokes, counting the penalty strokes. So when you ask me where I would rule on this, I think, you'd want to talk to the club membership and particularly the club leadership and say, what do you guys think? Are you willing to give up this for that? And particularly at the higher handicap level, I think most people are going to say, yeah, let's do that. I think for the club championship where they play scratch, I think many people are going to resist that because it's a different golf game.
Yes, that's why I love the name of our podcast, Spirit of the Game. because again, I draw this distinction just to create a contrast between the philosophy of spirit of the game versus the letter of the law. And so many times that simple summary, that those labels work nicely. So I look at this from the spirit of the game perspective. And in this one, I have to admit, it doesn't feel consistent with the spirit of the game that a player would be able to complete a round of golf simply by launching a ball and establishing a fixed point, never getting it on the golf course or never finding its location, and just using that estimate. And that becomes the connecting the dots in a stroke play competition that gets to a final score. So I see that for sure, that's a little bit of a breaking the link in the chain, which is sacred in stroke play. The winner is the person who played all 18 holes in accordance to the rules. And if one of those links is broken, you're disqualified. So again, don't misinterpret what I just said. I think this local rule is a good one. I do think you could argue that it's completely contrary to the spirit of the game, that for the reasons I just stated. But I think, and I think what I'm arguing myself into is kind of to your position, where the further you go up the chain, the more problematic that local rule becomes. Last comment on this one, unless you have other comments, is that there is some strategy to this local rule. If it is in play, if you hit your original ball and you sky it and it goes out of bounds 20 yards from the tee, you're probably going to re-tee it. You don't have to estimate where it went out of bounds. And if the local rule's in effect, you still have an option of stroke and distance. A lot of people, I think, assume that if that model local rule's in play, I'd lose the stroke and distance option. That is not true. It's an additional option. So I think it's worth noting that. Or if you hit a ground ball into the native, 20 yards off the tee and you can't find it, you can certainly go back to the tee and play under stroke and distance.
Yes. I think when, 8 players go out to play golf and all they want to do is have fun, then let them have fun and they can play the model local rules. It makes perfect sense to me. When you get to higher levels of competition, it doesn't make as much sense. And it departs from, one of the principles of golf is, you tee off on the hole, you play your own ball all the way to the hole, you play the course as you find it, and you play the ball into the hole.
That's right.
And so,
yeah. For once, we agree, Greg. How about that? I think we agree a lot, actually. And by the way, I know that you're becoming a regular on Spirit of the Game, so people hopefully know that you're not just some guy I invite on periodically. You're a true rules expert. You're chair of our rules committee. You've worked, I can't even countless USGA championships. So it's fun to have you on, and I'm sure you're in the middle of reviewing and getting ready to attend a USGA workshop. Is that coming up here?
Yes. It's kind of fun. They have a special workshop that is directed at just refereeing. It's not so much about the rules, and it's very difficult to get into. Last year, 2 of the rules directors got into it, and they brought home just so much information. And I thought I have to get into it. So I'm going to that this year, and I was very fortunate to be selected.
That's awesome. I look forward to hearing how that goes. I'm going to skip the second half of that question that I alluded to because it's kind of not that we have other good ones to get to here. So the next question is what I would call a he said, she said. And I get this question a lot, and there's a lot of people that operate under this belief that if there's a dispute in the rules that can't be resolved, the tie goes to the runner, so to speak, or the tie goes to the player. You always rule on behalf of the player. I've heard this repeatedly, so I thought that's why I wanted to spend a little time talking about that. So why don't you, is that true?
No, it's not true.
So how do you resolve, and what would you say to a player who's red-faced because, hey, we don't know what happened and I'm the player, so my vote should count in this? What would you tell that player?
Well, we have to examine all the available evidence, and that's going to include other players, it's any uh, spectators that were present, um, any information that you can glean that would help resolve a question of fact. Um, so, for example, if you have two players who are not the player in question here, but two players are adamant that the other player went into the penalty area, 100 yards closer to the tee pad than where the player who hit the ball is trying to take relief, which would give him a tremendous advantage. Well, that's 2-1. And the players, the other two really don't have um, a real vested interest in what's going on. They're just trying to do what's right. So if that were the case, we would probably take the information that the two players gave us and have the player drop where they believe the ball went into the penalty area. It gets a little trickier when there's just one person who says it went in here, and the player himself says, no, it went in way down here. And it's not like we're going to negotiate where it went in and split the difference. We're going to look at all that available evidence. And ultimately, golf is a game of integrity. And so we're going to go with what the player says. So you get into knowledge or virtual certainty, and that's a very specific definition in the rules of golf. And so when we look at that, some of these questions revolve around knowledge or virtual certainty that something happened or didn't happen, and trying to figure out who saw it, how many people saw it, what was their best angle that looked into it. On the PGA Tour, they can look at video evidence. But no, just because there's a disagreement doesn't mean that the tie always goes to the runner. So I made a short story long there, but we're going to gather all the information we can and going to lean us one way or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite terms in lawmaking is adjudication, the adjudicator of claims. There was funny at a rules seminar. Somebody asked the question. They were showing off their use of their vocabulary by saying, "So in match play, when I'm on the golf course as a referee, am I just an adjudicator of claims?" And that was one of the first times I heard adjudicator, so it stuck with me. But when you're an adjudicator, you're looking at all the facts. You're trying to get all the information you can to come to the right conclusion. Sometimes those facts don't line up. That's often the case. People have different versions of what happened, but as the adjudicator, as the judge and jury, you have to decide. I had an interesting one come up this summer. I won't name the golf course to protect the innocent here or the guilty. And it had to do with a claim in match play where a match came to the 18th hole, and the players were clearly not taking very good care of who was up and who was down. And one player thought the match was all square or tied. The other player thought they won one up when they reached out there, extended their hand to shake hands. Turned out they could not figure out where the error occurred. And so it really, I got a call from the golf professional, and we as adjudicators tried to figure out the unknowable. So basically the ruling ended up hinging on the order of play, because where it all started was what happened on the first hole. And what we tried to get to was who teed off on the second hole. Because if the one player who thought they won the hole, the order of play changed. So it was a fairly creative way to try to get to a red light, a bright light answer. Another one that comes to mind I was officiating at the Colorado Open on the 18th hole, a player hit their ball, to your point, Greg, about where did it last cross. And that was exactly what was in question. And the ball was in the ESA penalty area on the 18th hole at Green Valley Ranch, really close to the margin, but nobody knew how it got there. Did it cross right there within inches of where it came to rest? The ball was unplayable because for two reasons. One, there's a big fence there, number one. Number two, at the time, it was an ESA or a no play zone in today's terms, so they couldn't play it. So the question was, on a 200-yard, 250-yard shot, where did that ball last cross the margin of that no play zone penalty area? And finally, what I drew on was I needed a yes or no question to try to get to a fact. And I said, did anybody see the ball bounce? And based on that answer and the fact that nobody did, I said, okay, then it crossed back there. And we went all the way back 220 yards. So sometimes you have to kind of use a creative, Q&A or Socratic method to get to a yes or no answer. So again, the moral of that story is, you just because it was your ball doesn't mean you get veto power. Your vote does not count any more, any less than any other piece of evidence.
Yes.
Okay. Next question, and you teased it there a minute ago, was about known or virtually certain. And the question is, can you explain known or virtually certain, what that means? And the question goes on to say, we have a hole in my course with a penalty area that's surrounded by a lot of high grass, bushes, and other places where balls can be lost. I don't want to be that guy, but I often see players take relief from the penalty area, and I don't think that is right. Can you explain? So what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, a couple things. One is, if there's high grass and bushes between as you approach, like I'll use a lake as an example, you'd probably want to mark that so that that's included, so you don't get into these arguments about whether it's in the penalty area. But sometimes it's just inevitable that you're going to have junk surrounding penalty areas where a ball could be lost. And so it's difficult to determine, is it in the penalty area or is it just lost in the gunk? So we go to knowledge or virtual certainty, which is defined at length in the rules of golf. And so I'm going to read just a couple key points in it. Known or virtual certain means more than just possible or probable. It means that either, and then A, there's conclusive evidence that the event in question happened to the player's ball, such as when the player or other witnesses saw it happen. And B, although there might be a very small degree of doubt, all reasonably available information shows that it's at least 95% likely that the event in question happened. So for the player who has hit his ball, and it might be in the gunk and it might be in the penalty area, we're going to search for 3 minutes to see if we can find it. And if we don't find it, the default is not necessarily that it must be in the penalty area, because it could still be lost in the gunk. So I asked the player 3 questions. And I'll say, do you know for certain that it's in the penalty area? And they'll say no. And then, are you virtually certain that it's in the penalty area? And then I may have to kind of define it like what I just read. And he'll either say yes or no. And then the last question I ask is, could it be anywhere else? Say, for example, surrounding those bushes, there's a bunch of trees that overhang that, and he heard it rattle around in the trees, but didn't see it drop down. And so it may have dropped into the penalty area, and it may have dropped into the gunk. I don't think we have virtual certainty that it's in the penalty area, because you can't say that with a 95% degree of certainty that it made it to the penalty area. So, your writer, the area is surrounded by high grass. Well, that may be a course marking issue, and that's easily fixed, but it doesn't help him for that time. But I think he just needs to check off the boxes, like I just suggested. Does he know it's in the penalty area? Is he virtually certain it's in there? If he answers yes, then he can take relief. And if it could be anywhere else, then no, he can't, and he's got a lost ball.
Well, we all know as rules officials, there's a number of sort of quippy comments you can make if you really want to be kind of a smart guy. And for instance, when we've all been there as rules officials, where a group is searching for a ball in the situation that we're describing, where there's high grass and there's opportunities for balls to be lost in and out of the penalty area. And after the time expires for the search and they start proceeding under the penalty area, which is definitely more favorable typically because they're not going back under stroke and distance. And you say, wait a minute, do we know is it known or virtually certain that ball's in the penalty area? And they say, well, of course. And then you can remind them, well, then why were you looking in all these other areas? And while it may be a little bit of a, kind of a smart alecky comment, it's true. And one instance, and I've cited this on this podcast before, which really stands out, and it was so memorable. It was in the PGA Championship, and the two players that I know were involved was Jordan Spieth and Ian Poulter. It was Ian Poulter's ball, and Cliff Chavez, who's a well-known to us rules official, very well qualified rules official, was walking with this group. And after probably a 5-minute search at the time, Poulter's ball was not found in exactly the situation we're describing. And he, of course, started to take relief for the penalty area. And Cliff interjected, said, no, that ball, you need to go back, and pretty adamantly. And of course, Jordan Spieth came to Ian Poulter's aid and said, no, of course it was in there. And they had been searching and searching and searching, mostly outside the penalty area. Clearly, it was not known or virtually certain. So Cliff held his ground. They asked for a second opinion. Poulter was given the ruling he wanted, dropped the ball, and then lo and behold, before he played it, but after he dropped it, they found the ball. Guess what? Outside the penalty area. So I've seen Cliff, and I've told him you talk about validation, but it's a very commonly misused rule where what players, and again, I like the way the writer said, I don't want to be that guy. Sometimes you do. You have to do the right thing, and that's not always the most popular thing. But it definitely comes up a fair amount.
If this were the club championship or a tournament of consequence, and there's no rules official to adjudicate what's going on, you can always play two balls. You can take relief under the penalty area rule. Then you can also go back to the tee and hit a ball there, and then let somebody know, whether it's the club pro or a rules official, and they'll figure out what to do and what his score is when he gets into scoring. So now that takes time because he's got to walk back. But based on, the one that you talked about with Cliff, I'd like to know how they came to override what Cliff had originally ruled. And some of it's because on PGA events, they're member run and owned tournaments. And so the members are the players, and the players have a lot of political capital that they sometimes inappropriately interject.
No doubt about it. This was clearly a friendly ruling. It was a PGA Championship, so it wasn't a PGA Tour event, but still, it was home cooking for sure. It was like, well, sure. You want to be a nice guy, didn't want to be a stickler or whatever. It was the path of least resistance. I'm glad you brought up playing a second ball. That wasn't on our list of writing questions, but it's a really good one to remind our listeners that option exists. So why don't you just take a minute to explain, what do you do to avoid a he said, she said, or at least get to a better opportunity to preserve options when where something comes up and you're not sure what to do? Why don't you walk us through that?
This happens most often when there's an abnormal course condition that isn't marked on the golf course. For example, there's an area where it's been damp and some carts or maintenance equipment have driven through it, and there's big ruts in there, and your ball ends up in one of those ruts. Well, it's not marked, and so it's arguable whether it should be. It's arguable whether relief should be given for an abnormal course condition. And so, what you can do is you announce that you're going to play 2 balls, and then you take relief from that spot, from the abnormal course condition that you believe should be marked, and you play that ball, and then you also play the ball that's in the big tire rut, and you hole out with both of those balls. And then when you get into scoring, you tell who's ever there that I played 2 balls on the 4th hole. Here are the facts. They'll usually send a referee out there to look at it, and the referee will tell you which ball counts. And so we get through something very quickly. Pace of play is minimally impacted, and we're keeping players playing golf. So simple as that.
Yeah, and I agree. Let's keep it simple. What do you think is? I'd say the biggest misnomers about this. Number one, that players don't even know they have that opportunity. I was introduced to this rule playing in the CJ Pub Links at Highland Hills in the late '80s, maybe even the mid '80s, and a player said my ball was exactly in a situation, and I was ready to play it. It wasn't marked as with white paint. I was ready to play it out of a rut. And this well-informed player said, no, you have an option there. You can play 2 balls. And I was mystified. I really felt I was way out of bounds. This guy has no idea what he's talking about. Sure enough, he knew exactly what he was talking about. I did play 2 balls. I ended up scoring 5 with the ball, taking relief, 6 with the ball from the tire rut, saved me a stroke. So that was a pretty memorable moment. So I'd say it does exist. It's there to help you. It's only in stroke play. It's not available to you in match play. Again, the reason is in match play, you have a kind of a sister rule. You can make a claim. You have to decide between the 2 of you, if there's no rules official, what you want to do, and then ask later for a ruling, but you have to resolve it. You can't play a second ball in match play. That would create all kinds of problems. But I'd say the order in which the balls are played is certainly open for some confusion. But probably the biggest piece that people miss after they don't know it exists is announce which ball you want to score with, because it's not always the ball. It's not always the original ball, or it's not always the ball or I should say, it's not always the ball you're taking a drop with. Sometimes it's the original ball. But just so we keep it simple, what happens if a player does not announce which ball they want to score with? How does the outcome vary if that happens?
The default is that the first ball played becomes the ball that is the ball that you chose that you wanted to count, if you didn't make an announcement that you wanted one to count. So that doesn't happen often. It's usually pretty obvious. And if I'm in that group, I'm just going to say, which ball do you want to count? And, obviously, 99 times out of 100, they want the second ball to count. And the only times that, the only example I can think of that you'd want the original ball to count is if you were unsure that the original ball was in or out of bounds. And in that case, you want the original ball to count. But I can't think of another example that you would want the original ball to count.
Yeah, the only other one that I can think is you hit a miraculous shot, and you're like, "Whoa, wait a minute! I just hit an amazing shot from that rut. I just hit it in the hole. I now want
Right.
that ball to count."
Well, that's one of the reasons that you're required to report it in scoring. Um, Even if you scored the same with both balls, because it's possible that you didn't score the same with both balls, even though you took the same number of strokes. And the example that I'll give you is you're playing a course that you've never played before, and your ball ends up in a cultivated flower bed. And either the tournament didn't give you a terms of competition notice, or they don't have one, which is often the case. And so you think that you should get relief from this cultivated area. And so you say, okay, I'm going to take relief as if this is an abnormal course condition. And I want, and I'm going to play both balls, and I want the second ball to count. And so when you play out of the flower bed, you hold that ball. And when you play out of the where you took relief, you get a score that's different than that. And but if the course had a local rule that this is that relief is required out of cultivated flower beds, then that ball can't count because you didn't play by the rules of golf, and you'd have a 2 penalty stroke, and just it negates that play anyway because you didn't follow the rules of golf when you were playing unwittingly.
Right. Okay, we got one more, and that is another very common one. The writer says, "I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I was called out in my club championship for dropping on the wrong side of a cart path. My ball was in the middle of the path, and I just assumed I could drop on the fairway side of the path. I later found out that I should have been dropping in the high grass on the other side of the path. Why is this? That isn't relief." So we often talk about nearest point of relief is the right way to go, but not nicest point of relief. And this really touches on that. Maybe you can explain the difference between nearest and nicest.
Um, the player here, if he had been, if he's right-handed, but if he had been left-handed, he probably would have gotten relief on the side of the cart path he wanted. But you can't take an abnormal stance or make an abnormal swing when there's no reason to do so. It's interesting because he says the ball was in the center of the cart path. Well, if the ball's in the exact center, once you take relief, it's going to be on one side or the other because of your stance. Your stance is going to be, 18 to 24 inches away from where the ball is. And so, there's some great examples of this in the rule book. It'll show you exactly what they mean. But one side or the other is going to be the nearest point to where that ball was in the middle of the cart path. So you don't get to pick when it's in the middle. And so this is unfortunate. He gets relief from the cart path, but he doesn't get relief from the high grass where he ended up or should have dropped.
Yeah. There's so much here. One time I lived close to Lone Tree, and I was out on a run, and there was a player on the cart path on number 6 taking a drop correctly. For a right-handed player, the ball was very much like this writer described in the center of the path, and they were dropping it on a slope in high grass. But that was the correct side because it was clearly basic. Because remember, when you're taking relief and it's interesting, the precision of language now. One of the changes in the rules is kind of bundling and simplifying abnormal course conditions. A cart path is now an abnormal course condition. Is that correct?
Well, it's an immovable obstruction, which falls under the preview of the abnormal course conditions on the golf course.
Yeah, because when you were talking earlier, I want to call it ground under repair, and you were saying abnormal, not ground condition or abnormal course condition. Anyway, that's just it's a good change because it does sort of lead the reader to the same conclusion and really does simplify because it's the same outcome. Anyway, player was dropping it on the correct side, and one of his playing partners, fellow competitors, whatever we call those people now in stroke play, was wrongly correcting him, saying, "Oh, no, 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 you don't need to drop it over there. You can drop it over here on the nice side where the flat grass and the perfect spot." So he went ahead and shrugged his shoulders, and I was watching all this transpire, and I didn't want to intervene in my running clothes and come over there and put on my green jacket and make a ruling. So I just let it go. But I thought that was an interesting. Not often is it the case where the player is actually doing it right, and a fellow competitor is trying to, probably trying to be a nice guy and was adamantly wrong that they got to go to the nicest point of relief. So, well, listen, this has been fun. I always enjoy our chats where we try to keep these right where we're scheduled here, about 45 minutes in. Before I let you go, Greg, what is anything major changes that's come down the pike? It's not a rules change year, so anything going on as you study the rules that you think our listeners would benefit from?
Well, I'm unaware of anything. Usually every quarter there may be some clarifications. I'm unaware of any that are coming out in January. I suspect that in April there'll be one or two before the season gets in high gear.
So where is your workshop?
It's in Jacksonville, Florida.
Okay, very good. How many folks are allowed to attend these? They limited, I assume, to a smaller group, or?
It is a smaller group. I'm going to have to check. But yeah, it's a much smaller group than a typical USGA workshop. And the majority of it is done outdoors, making rulings. And all the outdoor stuff will be at TPC Sawgrass the week before the tournament. So, one of the points of emphasis here will be temporary immovable obstructions, which Sawgrass has a ton of. So it'll be neat to be there and then come home and then watch the tournament on television.
That's awesome. Well, listen, Greg, thanks for doing this under short notice. And next month, we actually have a great guest. Craig Winter from the USGA is going to be joining us. And I have a bunch of questions for Craig, who heads up the rules of golf for the USGA, reports to Thomas Pagel. But Craig is a great guy, and it'll be fun to get his thoughts on the rules. So
super.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next month.